everyone. Welcome to Data Driven Podcast. Today, I'm your host, Elif Tutuk. I'm the Global Head of Product at AtScale, and I'm super excited to have our guest, Sharon Richardson, today to talk about data mesh and how Databricks enables organizations with the data mesh concept. Sharon is the AI and data strategist at Databricks, and she actually has done a lot of also good research on decision and decision intelligence, which is very interesting, and that's why I think we are in this in the data business, right, to be able to support the decision making. So, welcome to the podcast, Sharon.
Thank you, and thanks for the lovely introduction.
So I think we are going through a very exciting time in data and analytics space. There's so much innovations coming up. I love what is going on at Databricks and the recent innovations that you have been making in the last couple of years. And just overall, like one of my personal interests is the data mesh concept. I joined AtScale last year to run the global product organization, but mainly because I spent 2 decades of my career innovating self-service analytics solutions. And for me, data mesh is very close to that concept in terms of how you enable the organization where more the people who are close to the business start the ownership of data and data product creation. But you can still do that with a central governance being in place and then enable that decentralized data product innovation. So with that, can you tell us how do you answer the question of what is data mesh? I think there's a lot of discussions going on that.
Yeah, sure. I actually personally stick with those 4 principles that were originally articulated by Zhamak Dehghani, and I apologise in advance if I didn't quite pronounce her name correctly. But she wrote, 2 fantastic articles. One originally, I think, late 2019, and then followed up with a more reasoned approach in 2020 that introduced these 4 principles that were all around about how to get the most value from your analytical data at scale. And I think by keeping focused and centered on one set of definitions, I think it helps give consistency to them because, obviously Databricks are a technology vendor. There's always that excuse that we could then come up with a nicely curated alternate set of principles that fit very well to us. And that's not the way to do this because it is as much about organization structure and operating models. It really is and should be technology agnostic, the data mesh concept itself. It's for us for how do we respond with a technology to make it happen. So it's those original 4 principles, that first one, that you need domain-oriented data ownership, which means decentralizing control. The second, and actually it's the principle I probably focused the most on, which is thinking about managing data like a product. I think that's a critical point, and I think that's where we've really seen a maturing in our approach to data management in recent years. That third one about having that common self-service data infrastructure as a platform, back to exactly what you said. Without that, you risk ending up just going fully decentralized into separate silos that cannot communicate, cannot work with one another. And having that third principle is all about stopping that from happening. And then the fourth is that you need governance, and the principle states federated computational governance. I think that's perhaps the area that causes and provokes the most discussion, in terms of what does it mean and what does it require. But yes, as a data mesh, I've always felt that I think Zhamak did such a fantastic job at articulating it. Even though many people say, oh, well, there's nothing original there. We were already doing a data mesh. It's like, well, you might have been, but we didn't have something to converge on. And I think that's where she's been brilliant with articulating those principles. And it benefits everyone if we all agree that those principles are a good foundation to start from when you're thinking about a data mesh.
Yeah, perfect. I love how you approach it. Let's kind of stick to the core definition of data mesh. And you're right. Every vendor has their own spin. Actually, I was doing another fireside chat with Zhamak yesterday for our Semantic Layer Summit, and it was great to hear these same principles from her as well. So I think, just as you said, one thing that I also like about this definition is just behaving data as a product, and that kind of goes to thinking about user needs. But then the other thing is, I think maybe we can do more deep dive on this federated governance part of it, and how, as the technology enablers, we can focus on that. So, do you want to kind of expand more on that and talk?
Well, in terms of the challenge, it's more the challenge of what do we mean by federated and the term federated, there we can argue what the definition means there, because there's federated, in which does it mean that all the domains agree jointly as a community on what governance means for the organization, because that would be truly federated decision. You're bringing, and I live in Switzerland. It's a federated set of cantons. It's been quite fascinating seeing referendums being happening all the time, with the voting on every government decision. It's truly federated. It's actually quite unusual to see. I'm not sure any other country does it quite to this extent. So if we're really thinking about it as an organizational principle, it's quite a challenge, because depending on the number of domains you've got, bringing consensus at a truly federated level, I think, is, for me, that's why I call it out. I think it's one of the challenges. There's another interpretation as well. My background is very much a blending of, I originally started out with a computer science background, but also with psychology. So always been very much interested in the human aspects and the impact on humans from advances in technology. And so the computer side of federated, a number of years ago, we started looking at federated search capabilities. And that was, well, you wouldn't have necessarily one index. You would federate your query across many indexes, and then you'd bring the combined results together. So that's a different approach to federated. So federated governance in that perspective could be for an organization that's got potentially multiple platforms in operation that may be running on completely different technologies, not just Databricks, they could be running on other technologies too. Each may have their own governance. So in that case, we're now thinking about particularly when we bring computational in, now we're thinking about, well, is it a case of being able to federate elements of the governance out to these platforms, but in a way that there is an end-to-end governed solution? So this is why I call it out, as I think, in terms of when I see customers that have adopted data mesh, I think they can be very quick to talk about how they're structured around domains. They're bringing product thinking in, that they've got self-service infrastructure. But ask about federated computational governance, and then I think the conversation is either less mature, or I think often I see, well, not so much think, but see, it tends to be, I would say more, it's like centralized governance. And the conversations I have with a lot of organizations is generally when they really want to sort of simplify their demands right down to the most base level within a data mesh, it's how do we have global consistency, global standards, global governance with local autonomy, local flexibility, so that the domains can operate effectively in their own environment. And people can be agile, they can innovate, they can drive forward at different speeds, because some parts of the business operate at very different speeds to other areas of the business. And we don't want to hold anyone back, but there are global constraints that we do have to place on the domains. And so I do tend to see it more as I think most end up adopting global, or I'll use global rather than centralized, because it can be such a loaded term when we're talking about a data mesh, but it is bringing what are the global principles that need to come into play, who decides on them, who agrees them, and then how do you implement them in as automated a way as possible. Yeah. So a bit of a long-winded answer, but yeah, that's why I think that fourth principle, I think, drives the most debate and head scratching when people are starting to think seriously about embracing data mesh.
That's very interesting how you have a product, like it's not only the federated governance, but federated computational governance. And let's come back to the search concept that you have mentioned. I would love to hear more about that. I guess, what I've been focusing on, like within the AtScale, within the product, just thinking about, how we can have the common definitions to be centrally owned initially. Like there has to be one definition of customer, one definition of product. But I'm also acknowledging that every business unit marketing may still have a version of that customer, because it's not like, again, they are the ones who are making the decisions based on the business needs that they see for their focus area. So with that, like, I think what I was thinking is to be able to have still a central definition, but then to be able to register that definition with that the definition of that data and make that available, and then let the business owners to start using, and then version that definition and the the structure of the data based on their needs, but then still have some type of a data contract to be able to keep track of who's using what version and what is, why, what business questions they are answering that. Is this aligning with your thinking?
Yeah, no, I think it absolutely makes sense. And it's an interesting conversation I've been having quite recently with a client too, which is trying to figure out how much can you achieve at a foundation layer, and that foundation is probably going to be centralized. So using your analogy of the customer definition, what are the absolute musts that that no matter what the different requirements are across the domains, these are certain either definitions, criteria that must be satisfied, and so they are going to be managed as that foundation, and that foundation is probably going to sit centrally. But it's also acknowledging that yes, there may be use cases where a specific domain needs to work with data in a different way, or they need to work with different features or different categorization or thresholds. For example, a simple one might be, think of spatial data. You might have spatial data coded down to the postcode or zip code level in your data set, but you might have a domain, and this is going to be a little bit silly and not quite applicable, but just to give the example, you might have a domain that's acquiring an external data set. It might be an academic data set, or somewhere that's already been given a certain amount of aggregation. So they've aggregated at some kind of regional grouping, and it might not be a particularly standard one, but it's the one that this data set's working with. Well, if you want to analyze spatially, you're going to have to effectively recode your data and bring in and code it to these spatial categories. But they're of no use to anybody else whatsoever. So it's an extra layer. So you almost think of sort of that level 1 foundation transformation, but we're going to do a level 2 transformation for this use case. But I think the criteria that's important is whatever you do down the line in the domain shouldn't undo or challenge or conflict with that foundation level, because that's when inconsistencies can come in, where you're producing models or analytics that are simply not reproducible anywhere else, or would even worse, would be challenged elsewhere. And we say, I can't reproduce those numbers. They don't make sense to me. That's what you don't want happening. So it's thinking about it as really, and this is quite my personal opinion rather than anything specific to either to Databricks or the industry, but I really feel you need it to be this one directional approach where your foundation has all the red lines that you cannot cross, but you have got a freedom to do more, but that whatever you do, it must not undo what was done before. You don't want to have to send data backwards and forwards and say, oh, well, we've changed it here and now we're going to copy it over there and we've got to try and unpick this and do it back. Look, that's when the complexity comes in that I think a lot of organizations have experienced in the past when pipelines go wrong. So it's avoiding those scenarios.
Yeah, I really like this approach. Like, I've been thinking, what we have gone through during the pandemic, right? Every organization, enterprises, they already have their data warehouses, data marts, star schemas, but like the business dynamic and the environment changed so fast that they weren't able to reflect the new business moment. Going back to your regional example, maybe there was a need to open a new warehouse or close some of the warehouses. Like, you have to be enabling that business units to apply that business moment to the data in a flexible and agile way, so that, as you said, like the core stays there as the definition, but then on the edges there's different versions of that agreeing without overriding. Maybe this is a great kind of way to talk about, like, I know you have been talking about different data mesh options. So one thing that I been referring is the hub and spoke. So there's the central definition and the spoke is the edges. Like, what is your perspective on those different data mesh options, what you're seeing at the customers?
Yeah, well, I touched on it in the article that's been published online on Databricks too, is because obviously to truly interpret data mesh is to produce what is tends to be called a harmonized data mesh. So there is no central authority if you're truly harmonizing as a data mesh. But yes, in reality, I would say with the majority of the customers I talk to about it will lean towards a hub and spoke model. It may be a very, very light hub, but there often is some need for centralization for multiple different reasons, and it varies by organization. For some, to be truly harmonized means having the luxury of having all the skills you need available within each domain. And it's like, well, that simply may not be practical for many organizations. data science is an expensive field. If you don't need high-end data scientists in every domain, but there may be times when each domain wants access to data science resource. Well, this is where hub and spoke starts to make more sense, which is to have a core of that high quality but scarcer skilled resource that can be reused across domains, but then absolutely things that are specific to domain will be skilled within the domain. So a splitting, some sharing of skills across domains generally necessitates some kind of, we often use the phrase center of excellence, for example, and it can be very light touch. It doesn't mean creating a bottleneck in the process, which is the criticism, and rightfully so, of many centralized environments. But it's about how to be as efficient and effective as possible with the resources that you've got available to yourself. The other scenario that we see tends to lean towards hub and spoke is thinking about data acquisition strategies. If you're acquiring data from third parties externally, does that data is it only needed by one domain? Because if it is, that's very straightforward, then the domain makes the acquisition. But what if that data is valuable to multiple domains? Which one owns it? Which one owns the acquisition? Which one decides to notify the other domains we've now got this data set available? Again, it makes sense that there should at least be some form of centralized process for managing data acquisition strategies if data is going to go across domains. And it also can apply internally, and this will depend on how you've defined and scoped your domains too, but a challenge can be where a data source, even internally, spans the domain definitions, because if we're being truly organized, it should be a data source should have a logical home in one domain and one domain only. That's the source, that's where it's processed, and its use elsewhere will be as a product. And it may go on to be consumed by the domains, but in a product environment. But there may be some data sources that this isn't still not quite clear cut. So again, you may say, well, for these, we're going to have some kind of central function that then serves out across multiple domains. So there are also, and I guess I've mentioned about acquisition, and I'll carry that through to the logical conclusion too, which is the sharing of data externally. Lots and lots of interest and talk right now around data marketplaces, commercialization of data becoming literally a product in its own right that can be used externally. And so again, do you want each domain managing this process, or do you want a conduit that you control? Now, you can argue if you've got your governance structure well set up in a harmonized environment, it should all happen very seamlessly and very automated. But again, it's the overhead, and there's governance isn't just about technology and code, it's policy, and those policies being kept up to date with changes in regulatory requirements, which are also updated, across the industry, including our own data and AI. The EU AI Act's just been updated, I think, in the last 2 days to start tackling how do we treat generational AI models such as ChatGPT. So again, do we expect every domain to be tracking these changes, or would it make more sense for there to be a central hub that has responsibility for these sorts of decisions?
That's very interesting. Like a lot of things again to do deep dive. Just interestingly, I've been having conversation with our customers as well. This concept of how you can, because like with the semantic layer, they are making the data business ready, right? And they have vendors, they have partners, and so just the thinking is how they can enable their external consumers with that business ready data so that they can actually start analyzing their own performance. Like, if you're a retailer, you may have vendors, and then if you already have their, supply chain data and delivery time. So if you can make that data that you are already using being the business ready, right, the inventory management, if you can open that up to the vendor, then they can start doing their self-service performance analysis and make decisions. And that is a very interesting concept. As you said, it's around the data market. So from all of those concepts that you have seen, how you see Databricks supporting these types of initiatives that could be external data sharing or having central governance, but also kind of creating a workspace so that the business units can start collaborating around data with the definitions of the data and the governance that needs to be in place?
Yeah, I mean, from a Databricks terminology perspective, this is what we look to do with data mesh. We're not making any claims. We don't sell a data mesh product, and we don't think you can. It's not a technology. It is an organizational principle. It's how do you structure, how do you organize. So for us, it's more a case of being clear in how you align our capabilities to the terminology. So at the simplest level, for example, we talk about workspaces as being an environment with which you can have dedicated compute resource to do all the different data processing and analytics capabilities that you want. And you can have multiple workspaces within a Databricks account, and they're running, and basically they're then sitting on top of a shared infrastructure. So you can already see that how we would align that terminology up. So for us, a workspace would be a logical mapping likely to a domain. It's not an absolute mapping. You could have many domains within a workspace. There's no hard boundary here. But if we want to try and keep it nice and simple as an analogy, think of the workspace to a domain mapping, and then our Unity catalog product is the one that goes across all the workspaces. So that's the global governance layer that then means you can put in certain principles to determine how do you manage access to your data, how do you audit access to, so you're monitoring particularly, and this is particularly important when you start to allow your data to flow externally as well. So we have delta sharing, the delta sharing protocol that's available. We very much connect with that with the Unity catalog, so you can audit and see exactly who has been accessing what data. We do things like automated lineage too, so that you've got that flow, so you can see how the data has been transformed from its original ingest all the way through to the different products it then becomes. So that's the global layer. And as we've already mentioned, it's all running on a shared infrastructure service. So that fits the third principle. And then the fourth one, back to data as a product. Unity catalog for us comes in here because it's about making the data assets discoverable. And we talk a lot about what do we mean as well, because generally the first thing people think of is, well, it's a table, right? It's a table of data. And it's like, well, it can be a lot more than that today. We're talking about AI as well. So it's not just data sets. We're talking about models, code pipelines, notebooks, dashboards. These are all forms of data product potentially that you want to make discoverable in a secure way. And that's why for us, Unity Catalog is the underpinning that global governance and product thinking principle.
That's perfect, Sharon. Like, we have an awesome integration with Databricks, and we also have an integration as AtScale with Unity Catalog. And just the way that I see our integrations for Catalog services is, semantic layer has its own unique metadata value, right? It's about the semantics of the data business definition. And just integrating with Unity Catalog is now we can actually make those data sets, exposed with an AtScale so that you can define the business definition on them. And then the users can actually use their BI and AI tool of choice. And as you said, like, I really see kind of like, maybe what's the right word, like how we can open up the power of Databricks and Unity Catalog to wider analytics consumers. It is how I see the AtScale, sitting on top of Databricks to enable that. And I think the other thing that sorry.
Yeah. I was going to say, absolutely. I think that's just a great example of what we were talking about earlier. This whole sort of directional flow from that foundation right the way through, and then it going through right up into the business logic layer as well. This is what is really transformative as we're starting to see people mature in their use of cloud analytics platforms.
Yeah. And some of the things that you have listed as the, awesome capabilities, like data lineage, like when you talk about the data product and thinking about user needs, like the data needs to be trustable. The user needs to understand where this data coming from, what type of transformation has been done. Like, maybe if you can expose more on that lineage, like how it's been, it's done in Databricks, and also like what value you're seeing at your customers.
Yeah, so this is really sort of underpinned our arrival with Lakehouse as a category sort of 2 to 3 years ago, because it was really the introduction of Delta Lake, this ability to bring ACID transactions capabilities to all data types. And it's worth giving a caveat. My background, because most people, your background is either if you came from the data warehouse world of very structured and tightly structured data, or you came from the more messy data lake and the precursors to it, which was file systems and knowledge stores and all the messy unstructured world. I'm from that world. I'm from the unstructured side of the world. And the beauty with Delta Lake has been bringing these two together, which is something I never really envisaged would ever happen. 20 years ago, we always used to joke, we'd go, yeah, there's the data warehouse. You can have your lovely very well curated, managed data, but all the cool stuff's happening over here, and it's chaos. It's very, very hard to put any kind of sort of transactional integrity on the ingest process when we're talking about unstructured data sources. So bringing that capability at the foundation level, that's what's been the real game changer, because it's having that layer of integrity on the top that then enables you to start tracking the lineage. You've got versioning capability. You can then start to see what's happening to this data and where is it happening as it goes through transformation pipelines. And and on top of that, and it doesn't matter what that underlying data is, whether it's a more traditional structured table or whether it's an image, it could be an IoT JSON streaming events coming from an Internet of Things device in a field somewhere. No matter what the data is now, they're all coming through this process. And that's, for me, is where the real power comes in, because then you can combine these different sources of data together much more effectively. Whereas in the past, we perhaps had a dashboard for one set of data, and we had a model and a Jupyter notebook or an RStudio output for the other set of data. Now they're coming together. And that for us has been what's been the real change with the lakehouse category.
Yeah, I'm super happy that you touched on the lakehouse concept. I just want to make a joke, like you are coming from unstructured. My background is structured. I think we are building the lakehouse in this call. But maybe for our audience, like if you can just expand more, how we have been having the data warehouse and then the data lakes, and now like what is lakehouse? Maybe just exposing on that more. So
yeah, and I'll try not to talk too much because I can talk for the country. But if you think, historically, we've had to have separate platforms because a data warehouse is a very well-established technology. It's 30, 40 years on. It was 1970s. You stop after a certain point counting any additional decades. But, it was very much COD back in the 1970s that envisaged relational storage systems to manage what was an explosion of data in that era. And so data warehouse is very, very well established, but really designed in the era of thinking that data means numbers, numerical data, hence we can structure it. I mean, most people, if you think spreadsheet, even though we use spreadsheets for absolutely everything, if you envisage one, you're thinking numbers generally in the fields, not your traveling list or your shopping list or all the other things that we also tend to use them for. So this world is very, very mature, very well established. The data lake it's just over a decade old. It's a much younger technology. And that really, it came into being around the start of the century with this whole explosion of what we call big data. And while some people roll their eyes, big data did have a very specific definition, which was data that defied all traditional management techniques because either the volume, it was on a scale we've never seen or had to handle before. But more interesting, it was these V's that actually Doug Laney of Meta Group that became Gartner, he first articulated these V's back in 2001, where he started with 3 in the published article. I actually discovered in conversation with him last year, there were 12, but they narrowed it down to 3 for the article. But the 3 big ones were volume, velocity and variety. So the sheer volume of data, the speed at which data is being captured and changes, and the variety, all of a sudden being able to query and digitize, our photos. We think it normal today that all imagery is captured digitally. Movies are now captured predominantly digitally. They're not using traditional analog film anymore. That's only happened in the last 10 to 15, and in fact, movies, I think, only in the last 5 to 6 years. At the turn of the century, not many people even had digital cameras yet. So it's easy to forget how quick that change has happened. So data lakes really arose out of this demand that all of a sudden we're digitizing handwriting, images, signals, things that previously were in an analog world. How do we process them? Because they are in such a scale, you certainly can't do it in a data warehouse. You can try and do it on your laptop, and good luck, it'll fall over quite quickly. That was the rise of the data lake, which was very, very clever separation of storage and compute as cloud computing became a thing, to be able to distribute the processing overhead across many, many computers and start analyzing this. It didn't happen in isolation, because at the same time we had, literally within a 5-year period, we had the deep learning papers released first by Geoffrey Hinton and others that triggered the arrival of neural networks. Again, they weren't a new invention, but having a method to actually use them was what changed, because they used the graphic processing unit, the GPU. NVIDIA then blew up the GPU capabilities. You know, we had this whole, I've got a plot of it somewhere, I'll happily share it. You know, we had this convergence of these different trends, which meant we were now able to analyze unstructured data on a scale we've never seen before. But no ACID transactions, no integrity. You know, you just throw your files in and you start playing. You know, if you want to secure it, you either secure the entire file or none of the file. There's no nice being able to select columns or rows and having attribute level controls, none of that in the lake world. And this is what's changing now very, very rapidly at the moment with the arrival of the lakehouse category, because we've now been able to bring these two together with this clever format with Delta Lake. That means now what's been a luxury in warehouse land, we're starting to be able to apply. And the beauty of that is that the payback goes the other way too, because by bringing the two worlds together, we can start bringing a lot of the data science tools to the warehouse data sets too. And that's equally exciting. We talk a lot about the serious stuff at the bottom, the security and the integrity, but it's also the models now that we can build by bringing these two worlds together. So I think it's a really exciting time.
Yeah, I 100% agree. That's why we have started our podcast saying that this is a very exciting time in the data and analytics. And to be honest, like I love what Databricks has done with the lakehouse. Like now we have many joint customers where, especially with the Databricks SQL, right? So like AtScale has been focusing on how you make that, structured data business ready for the wider, no matter what BI tool, you can just consume that data. And now with working with Databricks Lakehouse, like we are really opening up that value of the data, right, to be consumed. Like one of the exciting thing for me to see was like how an Excel user can actually connect to Databricks and then just do their analysis with the
It's
tool of
absolutely phenomenal.
yeah, like because I'm a finance user, I don't want to use a dashboarding tool. Like, but there are dashboarding tool like users like using Tableau, they love using that. But if I'm a finance user, I want to use Excel, and then just enabling them with the power and scalability and performance of all the things that Databricks Lakehouse provide through the AtScale and with Excel. It's just an eye opener for me, and then just providing the governance on top of that, so that you don't live in a hell of metrics and nobody knows what the definition of that. So that is kind of like one of the awesome use case that I'm seeing with Databricks Lakehouse from our joint customers. Like, do you have any examples of like joint customers or like the data mesh examples that you're seeing from the customers?
Yeah, we've actually had a few customers already present over the last 2 years at our conferences, and they've written articles on how they've deployed a data mesh designed architecture on Databricks Lakehouse. So what is quite interesting is, and at least a couple of instances, they would both say that it was something they were already doing. And this sort of, reversing back to what we were saying earlier, is that it's a natural evolution, because systems tend to cycle through centralized to decentralized to centralized to decentralized. And we were definitely going through one of these phases anyway over the past 2 years. And I think that's partly because when you're experimenting with a brand new technology, such as moving from on-premise systems into a cloud environment, it's absolutely logical to begin with a relatively simple centralized environment to begin with. It's usually quite small, it's quite contained, it's really proving art of the possible. It is a natural evolution. You start centralized, and then when you want to scale, centralized always hits bottlenecks problems at scale. And it's the classic network hierarchy. It's centralized, decentralized. And I think the beauty with data mesh has been to try, and Mac's vision on this has been to try and step in and to stop it from yo-yoing this cycle backwards and forwards, and say, well, let's come up with a solution that tries to stop this yo-yoing cycle and settle in. For example, one customer is Michelin. They very much have talked about this exact journey that they went on. They had that single centralized platform. It was great for that initial proof of moving and committing into a cloud-based environment. But then with popularity came those bottlenecks. And so they've now since deployed fully as a harmonized data mesh. And they have described their journey. They've published it up on their website. So if you search for Michelin 3 years after data mesh, you'll find that article. But I think they wrote that last year. So 3 years after data mesh, data mesh was only announced barely 3 years ago, I think under 3 years before the article was written. So it's kind of making that exact point that they were already on this journey, but it's helped give them a framework to strengthen it and to build something with resilience for scaling going forward. And a very similar one was HSBC spoke at our conference last year. And they literally titled their talk, How We Accidentally Built a Petabyte Scale Cybersecurity Data Mesh in Azure with Delta Lake. It's exactly that scenario. So, I think this is the reality is most customers who today already say they've got a data mesh were probably on that journey to decentralization as the article started to come out, and it gave them a structure on, well, how can we do this in a way that we don't fully decentralized and create costs or technical debts or silos? How can we prevent that happening? And that's where data mesh, I think, has been really successful here.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you're 100% right. Like the data governance, I think the customers and users have been going through this journey, because like every time, like since over the maybe in the last 10 years, when I first initially started the data governance conversations, it was always, okay, do we achieve this centrally, or how do we achieve with the business unit? So those discussions have been already happening, and as you said, they have all started the central, and then that kind of created a bottleneck, and now they start enabling the business units. And that's why it's an exciting time from solution innovation perspective as well, because now we are seeing the actual user needs, and now that from technology side, we are providing the right solutions to support the actual needs that is happening. So that is awesome to hear. So one thing that just maybe final topic to talk about, Sharon, in terms of like there are many data sources, and I know Databricks has been looking at the federation concept as well. And I think it is important to be able to kind of acknowledge and kind of ties back to the external data, or being able to share the data that kind of triggered this, my thinking in terms of the other data sources, and how federation through the Databricks can enable that as well. Do you have any insights that you can share around that?
Well, that's a tough one, because not really, I think, at this stage, other than to say you're absolutely right. It's an area that Unity Catalog is the absolute foundation for us for governance going forward. Will we see some rapid evolutions as we round out that product further? Definitely. Some of the public announcements we have already made, for example, has been how we're now very much unifying across all the data use cases that they feed from Unity Catalog. So it's very, the initial focus has been the more traditional data warehouse capabilities. So, through DB SQL and serverless into more traditional reporting, but also now bringing things such as feature store, model deployment, all the AI capabilities, having those surfaced up and discoverable as well. So there's lots of developments there, but also looking at how do you think about the end-to-end flow of data, where it comes into the system, where it goes out, at what point can we actually start being able to stitch full end-to-end governance pipelines together. But this is where it shows, and it's why I call it out, this fourth principle, the federated computational governance is itself, I think, in quite itself early stage. I think most people would agree with that. I think we will see some iterations, some learnings coming through at a technology agnostic level, even independent of anything Databricks or other companies are doing. I saw a really interesting phrasing of it in an article, and I can't remember the source, and I feel terrible when I can't cite the source, but they described a frustration with governance and saying it slows the projects down because nobody can agree on it, and everyone's up fighting over the policies, and they're saying maybe we should just be adopting minimum viable governance. And I thought that was a really interesting take. There's a risk there, obviously, because governance steps into once you're moving, particularly if you're in a regulated industry. But I thought it was actually quite a smart observation as well, because it was acknowledging that this whole industry is still moving and evolving and innovating at a fairly rapid pace. I mean, you've only just got to look at what's going on with all the hype and discussions around ChatGPT right now. So actually adopting that minimum level, and apologies, I am going to cough again.
No, this is, I love that. And this kind of comes back to also the, behaving the data is a product. It is all about applying the product management. In the product world, you talk a lot about the minimum viable, and I have a tendency to say minimum lovable product. And from that perspective, I think I just love that minimum viable governance.
No, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head there. I think if you're truly thinking about data as a product, then the minimum viable governance starts to make sense, because how much do you know about where that product will go and how it will be used? It's a bit like, you can sell a car. Is it your fault if somebody then crashes it? It's just, I'm being a really blunt example there, but well, no, you can't necessarily control the driver, but there are certain expectations. Provide seatbelts, install airbags. There are things you can do to protect people when the unforeseen or unfortunate happens that you would rather didn't, but it's outside of your control. We can't yet imagine, and this is a big debate because we're now in danger of moving into the world of ethics and AI ethics and responsible AI. These are challenges that, governments are grappling with right now, let alone companies, let alone technology vendors. And so they are going to change our perception of what is or isn't governance, and they're going to certainly change expectations on governance. So thinking about putting in that, the minimum layer and having the agility, flexibility to keep improving, to evolve it in as you need around a data product. There's kind of a lot of thinking that makes sense there, I think.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Wow, I mean, again, we can just go hours talking with you, Sharon, around all those different things. But I think this was a super interesting discussion. I love how you approach the data mesh, just sticking on the definition of it, and just always keeping in mind that it's a practice, organizational behavior, not a technology. But then I love how you have focused on the fourth point of federated computational governance, and that was a really nice touch. So any final thoughts that you want to add?
Gosh, on the top of my head, no would be the quick answer to that, because I think we've covered a broad range. I think I would still always round back to, particularly with data mesh, is that it is an organizational principle, structure more than anything. It's supposed to be technology agnostic. And I think that's a good thing, because it's thinking about, how do you operate your business? How do you become data driven? How do you do that in an effective way that can scale with resilience, with robustness? And this is where I think Zhamak's been really good at articulating this from day one. I get very frustrated if I see organizations trying to say, well, we've got a data mesh product and you can install it. It's like, no, that's really not what it's about. I think it's really good in that it's showing a maturing in the thinking of cloud analytics platforms. It's still a very, very exciting time. There's lots of growth and innovations going on, but there's also a maturing of recognizing this is becoming part of business as usual. And I think that's a very good thing to see too.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sherry. I'm, from the product side at Scale, I'm super excited to have the, co-innovation opportunities that we are doing with Databricks on many of the things. And just as you said, it's an exciting time to us together with, all of the vendors, like to be able to innovate as the user needs are kind of surfacing even more now with the data mesh concept. So thank you very much for joining us today. It was a great pleasure to have you on the Data Dream podcast, and I look forward to our future discussions.
Likewise, thank you so much for the invite. It's been an absolute pleasure.